We are back with our final conversation and our inaugural roundtable here at Parent Tween Connection. For those of you I haven't had a chance to meet, I'm Clarissa Constantine and I'm the founder. Our mission here is to create a community for all of the members of the proverbial village that it takes to raise a child. We focus primarily on supporting families who have kids between the ages of 10 and 20. We have Parent Tween Village, which is a great community for a lot of moral support and connecting with other parents who've been there and done that. But we also bring professionals to you like Martin Cinke. Marty, thank you for being with me.
Always a pleasure.
So you're going to notice in this conversation, if you've been paying attention along the way, there's going to be some fun banter here. And that's because Marty and I have actually known each other for 2 decades at this point. And we've been colleagues for a long time and became friends along the way. And I'm super excited to say that he's also one of the newest members of our Trusted Expert Network, which is a community of professionals who can support your kids that we've done some baseline vetting. So like they've gone through background checks, reference checks. They are who they say they are, and they're good at what they do. So we're talking one of my favorite topics, test prep.
I'm sure that's everyone's favorite topic, Clarissa.
It is, and this is why I'm so thrilled to be rounding out our roundtable talking about SAT and ACT. So first things first, Marty, let's talk about test optional, test blind, all of that jazz. This concept had already started before the pandemic. The pandemic accelerated the train a little bit, and the brakes are on in different places. But for folks who are, see kids coming, they're sophomores, freshmen, sophomores, juniors now, let's start there. What are these pieces? What do families need to know?
So probably the first thing every family kind of needs to do that's kind of has that sophomore, junior. Junior might be a little bit late to start looking at it, hopefully a little bit earlier, is doing the research on the schools that the kids are interested in. Because there is definitely these test blind, test optional, and some schools are now back to test required. So kind of knowing what they're going to need to be what the kids are going to be up against. There's 2 easy answers here. The first one is test required. Obviously, if any one of the programs that your child is looking at is now back to being test required, that means you're going to have them take an SAT or an ACT. The other easy one is test blind. If the school is test blind, they will not look at SAT or ACT scores either at all, which basically means you do not need any type of prep. You do not need me. You do not need to really even talk to me or anything like that. And just, submit the scores. Submit your applications without any test scores. If you did have some sort of test scores, they're not going to look at them. It will not matter. And then we come to the interesting one, which is test optional.
The interesting one. I like the way you put that.
Well, I mean, it's the one that's going to create a lot of issues, or not issues, but like kind of there's some questions of, do I submit scores? Do I not submit scores? Things like that. For test optional, a good score can help. I know I work with a lot of students. A lot of students have good grades. They can write a good essay. All the parts of their applications look good. They have their volunteer work, extracurricular activities, and kind of all the stuff that goes into an application, which is not my area of expertise. But I know, Clarissa, I know you have a bunch of people in the Parent Tween Connection that can help out with that. But a good score can help for a lot of schools, because there's a lot of kids out there like that who do have like the good grades and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not saying it's the be all and end all in terms of, is your child going to get in with a good SAT score or not? Yes, you could obviously get in with not submitting a score at all, since it is test optional. But having a score that can kind of stack up to all these other applicants, because schools are getting a lot more applications now because it's test optional.
Absolutely. Yep.
And it's one way to kind of stand out, or kind of know, like, let the school know, hey, I took this extra step. I actually went, I did an SAT or I did an ACT, and look, here's my score. It's a pretty good score. And hopefully that will help your child get into whatever program it is.
So then the other aspect, and the conversation that we're having so far, is expressly related to admissions, right?
Yes.
The other aspect that I know a lot of families are curious about is scholarships. And so I think there's an aspect that we need to bring this little piece in, because there are scholarships out there that do require these test scores.
I'm not going to say there are a lot of them, but there's definitely some possibilities to get a scholarship based upon a good SAT or ACT score.
Mm-hmm.
So it's another way potentially to bring some extra money to the table of, making college a little bit less expensive, a little bit more
Absolutely.
affordable.
Yeah.
So definitely that is another reason to potentially take an SAT or an ACT, not just for admissions purposes. Yes.
Well, and so for anybody who's listening or watching, we do have a couple of interviews in the archives from the roundtable that do reference scholarships. One of them was with Ryan Wisniewski. He is a college financial planner. And one was with Dr. Roz, Elizabeth Rosner. We actually just chatted yesterday, and her program is called Debt Free Degree with Dr. Roz. And you want to talk about like outside the box thinking of how to not end up in debt for the rest of eternity in exchange for a diploma. She's got some really cool, like very different ways of approaching things and very different perspectives on how to get that degree without having to spend a ton of money. And so I like that here we're primarily focusing more on the admission side of things relative to SAT and ACT. So here's my question. You've been saying taking an SAT or an ACT.
Yes.
Setting the record for folks who are listening, to your knowledge, is there any college in this country that quote unquote requires one but won't take either one?
As far as I'm aware of, they will take an SAT or an ACT. It doesn't really matter. Most schools have some sort of, like, I'm sure, score conversion chart or whatever it is, where they will just translate one SAT into an ACT score or an ACT into an SAT score. It really is finding the test that is better for your child. And there are obviously some differences in the SAT or the ACT. I've worked with students who score significantly higher on one versus the other. I worked with students who score about the same, and then it comes down to a little bit of personal differences, kind of figuring out like what they're good at, what they're not good at. Potentially the timing or the structure of one of these tests feels a little bit more comfortable. So that's all kind of part of that process of figuring out, once they figured out that they do need to potentially take one of these tests, is which one is it going to be? And there's kind of a process that goes along with that also.
Yeah. And so that's actually, for anybody listening, that's going to be a conversation that Marty and I have exclusively for members of Parent Tween Village. So stand by. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but there is more coming on that. So, all right, once we know the schools that we're looking at, so actually, let me back up. This means that our kids need to have a clue, not necessarily a defined list, but a clue about what schools they might want to apply to, because then we can start going to the school websites to find out whether they are test required, test blind, or this interesting test optional. That's also where, as you mentioned, we have professionals who are college admissions folks who that's like their jam. That's what they do. They help students find those schools. But that information is the first step in figuring out what prep is going to look like. So then we've got the figuring out SAT versus ACT, which we're going to talk about with Parent Tween Village. From there, what types of prep should families be looking at? I know you and I know that there are an array of options that have different fits for different kinds of kids, but broadly speaking, where do parents start with this?
I mean, I'm always happy to have a conversation with any parent, just kind of once the kid has done a little bit of research and to kind of see if they're what they're interested in or what might work best for the kids. Some kids do well in classes. I know there's a bunch of prep companies out there that do test prep, SAT and ACT test prep. And that might work for someone. It depends on a lot of times it depends on starting score, what score they need to get, what they're looking to get. And sometimes having a class with 10, 15 kids in it is totally appropriate and will work for some students.
It's also the fiscally easier sometimes option to pursue because you have multiple students absorbing the cost of a singular tutor. Or a singular
it will be your more cost-effective option. Absolutely, yes.
Hey, it's what is, right? There's group options. That's why there's like group X at the gym, and then there's personal trainers. So, and then there's private tutors.
And then there's private tutors. A couple advantages, obviously, to working with a private tutor. One, schedule-wise, I can talk with you or talk with your child and figure out what schedule works best.
Mm-hmm.
After school, is it at 2 o'clock? Is it at 3 o'clock? Is it at 5 o'clock? Is it at 7 o'clock after basketball practice or after football practice or whatever it is?
Sure.
Is it on a weekend? Is it on a Saturday or whatever it is? So scheduling wise, there's a lot more flexibility, obviously working with a private tutor.
Sure.
And then the customized approach to the actual content. I know students learn differently,
Mm-hmm.
and I have taught classes. And when you're teaching class, yes, I can kind of, fine tune some of the material to each person, but there are 15 people in the class.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot, unfortunately, as much as I wish I could, and I know you're in the same boat. As much as we wish we could help each individual child, like if there's a big class or something like that, there's only so much we can do. But working one-on-one, like if someone doesn't understand a problem one way, a lot of times there's 2 or 3 different ways to solve that problem and to figure it out. And there's also strategies to these tests.
Mm-hmm.
You don't actually have to do every single question to get a good score. Now, you're going to put an answer down, but doesn't mean you actually have to actually do every single question. So there's kind of ways to, depending on strengths and weaknesses, to manipulate again. I don't know if that's a great word, but manipulating these tests
playing the game, certainly.
You're playing the game. You're playing the college admissions game. You are playing the test, the SAT, ACT game of how they score the test based upon it's just questions. Do you get it right versus wrong? There's no partial credit. One of the most frustrating things, I'm sure, for all kids is when they do like 9/10 of the problem correct, and then they pick B versus C or whatever it is, and it's for the SAT or the ACT. It's just wrong, unfortunately.
So, when do students need to start thinking about this process? What's the earliest that you recommend?
I do work with students the summer after their sophomore year.
Okay.
And that is helpful sometimes because I know that students get busy. If they're in a fall sport, they're in a winter sport, they're in a spring sport or whatever it is, yeah, they get busy. And then if in their junior year, if they're in some AP classes, then they have their AP tests and things like that, where some students do appreciate working like over the summer, be it June or July or August or whenever it is. Again, that's, flexible, and not having to deal with homework and sports and after school activities, kind of at least get that first test out of the way. And when I say first test, I'm always going to recommend to everyone to plan on taking the test at least 2 times.
Okay.
I hope you don't have to, and I hope they don't have to. But some schools or a lot of schools will super score, which is they will take the highest score for the different various sections within each test across different tests. There's kind of very little drawback to taking it more than once. If your math, let's say we're doing SAT, your math score goes up a little bit, but your reading and writing score goes down. A lot of schools will take your higher reading score and they will take your higher math score. So working over the summer, sophomore year, you can take that test in August or, depending if it's SAT or ACT, August or September or October or whatever, kind of get one out of the way. If you need to take it again, there's a lot of possibilities of November, December, or then there's like February, March, April, May, depending on whatever works best.
Right.
I always think it is best to try and get one in by December of junior year. So yeah, junior year. So like kind of halfway through, getting one in, and then if necessary, again in March, April, May, or again, whatever it may be. If absolutely necessary, if that doesn't fit with the timeline, yes, you can still prep over the summer after junior year. And schools will accept scores that you take at the beginning of senior year. But there's a lot more stuff going on. Again, this is more for the other college, counselors and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I know a lot of students are going to want to do a little bit of college visits. Maybe they do that in, whenever they're going to be doing that. They want to enjoy a summer. Maybe they have some sort of vacation they're going to go on before senior year, whatever it may be. It gets a lot. So I do think it's helpful to get started a little bit earlier. Apologies.
Yeah, no, because then like in senior year, they've got like all the cool, fun senior stuff in fall. There's homecoming where maybe you're part of the homecoming court or, just all those cool things that, they only have senior year only happens once. And so I definitely see where you're coming from of going like, if we can avoid having to retake these in the fall of senior year, like why wouldn't we? If we can, but they're there as a good backup.
There's a backup. I mean, I've had students who email me and they're like, or their parents get in touch and, oh no, we ignored it, we forgot about it, or whatever it is, and we need to get a good score by whatever date
Right.
it may be,
Right.
and it's then it's also a little bit of like a lot more pressure on the kid too. Like, oh, there's only one more test date or two more test dates that you can kind of fit this in, get that score that you're looking for.
Right.
The other thing I will say in terms of starting earlier is I have worked with some athletes, and a lot of times these athletes do need to actually have scores a lot earlier than typical students who are not in any type of athletics.
Yeah, they're the kids who are being recruited, because the first thing when a college coach reaches out to a high school athlete, first thing they ask is, what's your GPA? What are your test scores? I can speak to that. My husband's been a sports performance coach, spent 12 years doing that. And now he's switched to some of like the teen mentoring. I know you and Joe have talked, but he has had so many kids come back to him. Coach, you were right, man. First thing that they asked me was, what are your test scores and what's your GPA? So I think that's a
they
really
need to know if they should keep pursuing that athlete, can right. that person get into the program?
Absolutely, because they do have to be able to get in.
Yes.
And there's also an aspect too, especially, D1 football, there are some full rides. D1 soccer, But for pretty much all other athletes, especially once you hit D2, and well, definitely D3, because D3 doesn't actually offer athletic scholarships. But they're pulling together a combination of athletic scholarships and merit scholarships. So that's a big piece. I mean, merit scholarships are GPA and test based frequently. And so the coaches are looking at it going like, what can we patch together to bring this kid here? Do we even have a shot
for them to be able to afford or be able to come to our program? Absolutely. Yes.
Exactly. Absolutely. All right. So you said as early as sophomore year, or I'm sorry, as early as the summer between
sophomore year.
Right. What kinds of academic classes do you see as critical?
So not really, unfortunately, not a ton. The SAT and ACT, obviously having a math background or having a math class that has done geometry and your basic algebra 1, algebra 2 stuff. Mm-hmm. But the SAT is kind of its own special little, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, special case, special whatever it may be, where a lot of it does come down to getting comfortable with the test. And there are some very specific test-based strategies for both of those that are not like any classes in school. And I know a lot of kids that I work with, high schools no longer teach grammar. There's grammar on both of those tests. Yep. So even if you wanted to say there was some sort of class, there are very few students that I've worked with that actually come in and say, oh yeah, my English teacher taught us subject verb agreement or rules for pronouns or whatever it may be. And there's grammar on both SAT and ACT.
Yeah. Okay. And so sciences, ACT science?
ACT science is not science. It is mostly reading charts, tables, and graphs. There's a little bit of kind of the scientific method of if you do an experiment, do you want to change 5 variables at the same time and see what happens? Well, I'm going to give you guys a spoiler right now. For any of people who have not done science in a while, you don't want to change 5 variables and see what happens because you're not going to know which of those variables affected whatever result it is. So there's kind of that little basic scientific thinking of change 1 variable at a time, see what happens and things like that. For the most part, the ACT science section is reading charts, tables, graphs, things like that.
Right. Awesome. When is it too late? Speaking of timeline.
I mean, we can throw something together in 2 or 3 weeks, There's a diminishing return at some point there. Like what I can teach you the basics in a couple weeks. We can kind of cover like the big picture strategies, which I've done before, and it definitely can help you pick up some points.
Sure.
For most students, this is, I would probably say you'd want to think of this as like a 3-month process,
Okay.
from the initial conversation to kind of the prep, get ready for a specific test date, whatever test date that we have in mind, go take the test, see what happens, and kind of go from there.
Go from there. Do everything you can to put as many eggs in the first test date basket as possible is what I'm hearing. But have a backup in case any fall out and you need a second.
Yes. And listen, taking it a third time isn't terrible. Schools generally don't care. Like I have worked with students who did take it 3 or 4 times. It just happened to work out that way. One day they had a good math day, then they had a bad, whatever it was. Like it just happened to take a little bit more time. And a lot of that depends on starting score and target score. Like how long is that going to take? If you're only looking, let's say we're talking SAT and I need to pick up 100 points, that's a different conversation than if I need to pick up 300 points.
Right. And I think that's back to what you were talking about, like the more customization with somebody one-on-one versus a group. I mean, there are some really good group classes out there. There are some really good self-paced programs that are going to be even less costly on the fiscal side of things, that if you've got a dedicated student, they can see some pretty good progress. But if we're looking at something one-on-one, going like, okay, well, if you want 300 points of improvement, having a custom program is likely to help them get to that 300 point improvement more directly, I think is probably the easiest way of putting it, right?
I would agree with that. And I mean, again, if you look at your kind of, you take a practice test and look at what score you have, and then you're thinking, oh, I need to pick up 50 or 70 or whatever points. Again, I'm doing SAT versus ACT. I'm doing SAT scoring here. We can talk more about ACT scoring, but it's kind of the same idea. Depending on how many points I need to pick up, definitely some of the free programs or kind of the free SAT prep or whatever. There's a bunch of resources, or even going to grab a textbook or a book from buying one of the SAT prep books and doing some practice tests and things like that. It can be helpful.
Sure. If for no other reason,
points for $20.
Right. Well, and I mean, familiarity, like studies do show that if students take it a few times, they start to see incremental progress simply because they're more familiar with what they're dealing with. Not necessarily because they're actually changing their approach, but they at least have a better sense of what to experience. But I know that ain't going to get 300 points. So
it's probably not going to get you 300 points, but I know that there have been studies that I'm sure these test makers, College Board and ACT have said that if you take the test more than once, your scores are typically going to improve. And it is true. They probably are, just because you've seen similar questions.
Well, it's kind of like saying, oh, if I move more, I'm probably going to lose weight. That's probably a fair statement, assuming you don't eat more cookies because you're ravenous when you get home from the walk.
And I do like cookies.
All right. So if you are interested in learning more about the SAT and ACT and the distinctions between the two and how to decide which one is a better fit, Marty and I are going to have a conversation in Parent Tween Village. If you don't know Parent Tween Village yet, it's our family community that has exclusive conversations like what we're going to talk about. But before we go there, we're going to talk about the foundations of connection. So for those of you who aren't familiar with these came out of a conversation that I had with myself a few years ago, a couple of decades into my own test prep career. I was like, why is it that frequently students will be ready to chat with folks like Marty or me or other of their coaches about topics that they're not quite ready to talk to mom or dad about yet? And I was like, why is that? What do we bring to the table that the kids aren't necessarily feeling at home? And so all the letters of the first letters of each of these phrases spell out the word connection. So I'm going to read them for folks who don't know them. And Marty, I'm going to ask you, which one pops up the most for you, either as it relates to our conversation today, or I know you're a dad as well. You've got youngsters and you've got teens in your world. So I'm just kind of curious, like which one pops up for you? So here we go. We have create a safe place, observe, non-judgment, nod, and smile, which you're doing really well right now as you bite your tongue. Nicely done. Then we have explore. I sometimes use that to the E to say educate. Challenge your truths or curiosity. Take your time. Innovate. Own your own story, or nurture.
There's so many good ones in there. I think probably the biggest one is non-judgmental. Like
Okay.
I'm here to basically help you learn, help you get a better score.
Uh-huh.
That's what it comes down to. And you mentioned I do have children in my universe. I have a child of my own. She is 6. She will probably never want to come to me for tutoring. I understand that, and I think that's part of it. Like, I don't know. I feel like it's someone else's opinion that is
Right.
not your mom and dad's opinion, which I don't know. Like, I feel that is like a big thing. Like, hearing it from somebody else versus hearing it from mom and dad makes a big difference. Even if I say the same thing as your mom, which is do your homework or whatever, I do sometimes feel like hearing it I know when she hears it from somebody else, like when she's with other kids and I was at a birthday party and Ariel came to visit. It was a 6-year-old birthday party. Ariel was giving all these instructions of sit down. You guys all need to sit down so we can do our balloon animals or whatever. These kids listen, no problem. If I said that, I don't know if my child would be like, oh yeah, I'm definitely going to just sit here and wait for you to do whatever it is. So I definitely think there's something to be said about that. And then
But you got to, but Marty, I'm going to interject. There's the aspect that like Ariel has amazing hair.
what are you saying?
I'm saying that your hair is not nearly as amazing as Ariel's. That's why she listened.
Okay, that is, I'm sure that is it. Thanks, Clarissa. I appreciate that. Always great.
Right,
I've missed you.
We meet the kids where they are. Okay, so with that, I'm going to close with this before we go talk about SAT, ACT. How do you define a good score on either of these tests?
Whatever score gets you into the school that you're looking to get into, which varies from program to program. Mm-hmm. You want to get into a Stanford versus I'm trying to think of, let's think Ivy League schools versus something that is not an Ivy League school. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people who want to get into an Ivy League school. I work with a bunch of students. They're like, my list is Ivy League schools. Okay, well, that's going to require a lot higher score. It's going to be a lot more competitive versus, again, I don't want to throw any kind of random names out there, but there's other schools that are not going to be as competitive.
Right.
So, again, that's part of doing the research of like what schools you're going to be applying to. The college counselors at schools, at each kid's school, a lot of times are a great starting resource for things like that. But then, we've already talked about this. There's definitely professionals that work in this field that can help fine tune what programs there are and give a better idea. Like I know a couple of these coaches, and a couple of them, they refer their students over to me. They're like, yeah, we need an extra 100 points, or we need an extra 150 points, or whatever it is. They have a really good idea of what that score is going to potentially be. I have some idea, but they have a really good idea of what they do. What a student might need. That's what they do.
Awesome.
They don't prep their kids for SAT and ACT. They come to me for that. I will, refer questions like what exactly score do they need to them.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So we have a sense of test blind, test required, and test optional. We have a sense of when to start prepping. We have a sense of about how long it's going to take. We have a sense of different types of programs that we can go after based upon what those goals are and what we see as a good score in our world. And we're going to go ahead and wrap up this conversation. For those of you who are interested in more of the details that we're about to talk about, you can find more information about Parent Tween Village on our website at parenttweenconnection.com. So Marty, thank you. Glad to have you, friend.
Excellent. Thank you, Clarissa.